Hello and welcome to lesson 11. We're going to be finishing up the skeletal system today. We're going to be talking about the different types of joints and then some homeostatic imbalances. So with the exception of the hyoid bone, every bone in your body forms a joint with another bone. And a lot of times you're going to hear the word articulate or articulations. That's really the medical term for a joint. So when two bones are coming together, we call that an articulation. So we can, for example, say that the head of the femur articulates with the acetabulum of the coxal bone. So joints are going to be classified by function and structure. So first let's talk about functional classification. And what I mean by function is how much they actually move. So synarthrosis joints are immovable joints. And a really good example of this is going to be the sutures of the skull. So those kind of fibrous joints holding those bones together. Amphiarthrosis are slightly movable joints, and then diarthrosis is going to be freely movable joints. Then we have to look at the structural classification. We are going to be focusing on synovial joints in this presentation because that's really the joints that we're most familiar with. It's important to know fibrous joints, which once again are going to be those sutures of the skull. We also have cartilaginous joints. That, for example, is going to be the pubic symphysis holding your two coxal bones together. So we're going to focus on synovial joints. And the first thing to understand are the four distinguishing characteristics of these joints. One, they all have articular cartilage. These are going to be on the end of bones, and these are made of hyaline cartilage. These create that frictionless surface for bones so they don't rub bone on bone together when you're moving. They all have a fibrous articular capsule. Basically, you're going to have a membrane on the end of it. They're all going to have a joint cavity which contains lubricating synovial fluid, and they're all going to have reinforcing ligaments surrounding them. So now let's get into the different types of synovial joints. The first is going to be a plane joint, and this is usually when two bones are coming together on a flatter surface. There's not a lot of movement or rotation at all, just kind of slipping or gliding movements. An example of this would be the joints between your carpals and your tarsals, so your wrist and your ankle. Then we have the hinge joint, which is a common joint because we always think of the elbow and the knee. Those are going to be hinge joints. So one bone is going to fit into the trough of another bone. And if you remember, we talked about the elbow. They're going to have the fossa, and then you're going to have like an extension of the other bone fitting into that fossa. And you're going to have movement really just in kind of one plane, like a mechanical hinge. So we call this uniaxial, meaning that it only moves in one plane of motion. Your elbow and your knee move in that sagittal plane of motion, which is up and down movements. Okay, the pivot joint. Pivot joints are the rounded end of one bone is going to fit into the sleeve or ring of another bone. And really, the really best example I can give you of this is going to be your atlas and your axis and how they're able to rotate on each other. So they're only going to be uniaxial, and with your atlas and axis, that's going to be going in the transverse plane rotation. Then we have saddle joints. These are biaxial joints, meaning they can move in two different planes of motion. This is going to be, for example, your thumb. Your thumb is a really great example of a saddle joint. You have a convex and a concave surface that fit perfectly together. Then we have a condyloid joint, which is basically going to be your knuckles. So these are going to be the joints between your metacarpals and carpals, and also your metacarpals and your phalanges. So they're going to be egg-shaped, meaning that the one of the bones is going to be like an oval shape, and then the other is going to be concave, and they fit together. And then the ball and socket joint, one we're very, very familiar with. You have the head of one bone fitting into the socket of another, and the head of the one bone is rounded. The best example of this is going to be your shoulder and your hip, and these are really the ultimate joints for movement. They can move in all of your axes, and they provide the most movement for you. So now we're going to move on to homeostatic imbalances of the skeletal system. Bursitis is inflammation of bursa. Bursa sacs are part of that joint cavity. These are pockets of fluid that can become inflamed when you overuse that area. So a lot of times we see people get like bursitis of the hip, for example. A really good treatment for this is just going to physical therapy. You get an ultrasound on it. You get kind of different exercises to help strengthen and then rest. And then a sprain is an injury to a ligament. And there's different degrees of sprains. You can even just stretch and slightly tear a ligament, or you can completely tear it. And that's going to be a different degree. And based on what ligament you have sprained, you may or may not have to get surgery. For example, if you have a grade 1 ACL tear, you've just stretched the ligament, and a lot of times you don't need surgery. But if you have like a grade 3 where you've torn it, then you're going to have to get surgery on it. Then we have arthritis, and we're going to talk about two different types of arthritis: osteoarthritis and rheumatoid arthritis. Osteoarthritis is the one that we're really familiar with. This is as we age, we have that articular cartilage on the end of our bones breaking down over time. This causes bone-on-bone rubbing and can be very painful and cause inflammation, but it's really just a part of aging. Most of the time we see it in the knee, in the hips, a lot of times in the fingers, in the vertebrae. That's the most common areas. So this is a picture showing you the difference between a normal and an osteoarthritic knee. So if you look here, here's like your nice joint capsule. It's enclosed. You have a lot of fluid in here. You have nice articular cartilage on the end. Over here, we see that the joint space has gotten smaller. The articular cartilage is starting to wear down. The inner lining of the capsule is starting to break down. We have inflammation, and we have less synovial fluid. The other type of arthritis is called rheumatoid arthritis, and this is an autoimmune disease, meaning that we're not exactly sure why our body attacks our synovial membranes, but they do. And it really can occur at any age, but normal onset is 40 to 50, but I have seen it in younger individuals as well. So basically, the synovial membranes begin to thicken into what we call a pannus. And this tissue starts to break down articular cartilage. The end of these bones become deformed, the joints become very painful, and you have a lot of restricted movement. And as you can see here, this is an x-ray of someone that has rheumatoid arthritis. A lot of times you really see it very prevalent in the hand. It's very sad. A good treatment for this is you go in and you get steroid injections, and they literally will inject steroids into the joint space to try to stop any degeneration. And then you can see over here, this is normal. We have our nice capsule, we have our nice cartilage, we have some fluid inside of there, and the pannus is where we get this basically inflammation of this synovial joint, this thickening of it, to the point that the bones become deformed and almost fuse together. Then we have osteoporosis. This is a big concept in this class. So osteoporosis is a bone thinning disease, very common in older women. Really what it is we just start to break down bone, and we see fractures occur with this. And the most common type of fracture is going to be the radius of the wrist and also the hip. And it's really the neck of the femur that's really going to just snap. And that's when you see older individuals have to get a knee replacement. It's because the neck of that femur literally snapped in half. What happens also is we see that the vertebrae start to kind of collapse and fracture in on itself. That's why people with osteoporosis tend to lose height, and they also develop the hump on the back. We call that a Dowger's hump. So what are some causes of osteoporosis? You have to have a good diet in calcium and protein. And as we get older, protein is harder to metabolize and store and be efficient. So they often tell older individuals to eat more protein. Lack of vitamin D, that can be genetics. Sometimes people have a problem in processing vitamin D. Smoking, a sedentary lifestyle or lack of exercise, and then a decreasing amount of estrogen in the body. So this is really going to affect women, this decreasing amount of estrogen, because as you go through menopause, your estrogen numbers drop like crazy, and then that's when we start to see osteoporosis rise. And what is actually the physiological cause of osteoporosis? Well, basically, osteoblasts are not creating new bone as fast as osteoclasts are breaking it down. So you're removing old bone by osteoclasts, and you're not building enough up. All right, so that concludes our Lesson 11 presentation. Please make sure you have filled out your note guide, and then you can get started on all your exercises and assignments.